This week, as we read Chapter 8 in Henslin's text, we continue our study of the impact of socioeconomics on the lives of individuals in society. Specifically, we're looking at the effects of social class and poverty in the United States this week. And in the first part of this week's lecture, we're looking at different definitions of social class and also how wealth is distributed in the United States. First, a definition of social class. The social class is a large group of people who rank closely to one another in wealth, power, and prestige. A fairly simple definition, I think, for us to consider social class: wealth, power, and prestige. Now, these components of social class actually come from Weber's definitions, I believe, of social class, and are sometimes called the 3 P's, because instead of wealth, what you find sometimes in place of that is property. So it would be, in Weber's terms, property and wealth, power, prestige. So property or wealth is really something that, well, we talked about this in previous lectures. This is about the value of a person's assets. This consists of property, income, and investments and things that are making money for the individual that owns it. And remember from last week's lecture, income and wealth are very different factors, very different features. Power, of course, is the ability to get your way despite resistance, and we studied the concept of power a few weeks ago when we looked at socioeconomic forces and power. And finally, prestige is the respect that's given to an individual because of one's occupation. And some jobs are of higher prestige and others are of lower prestige. But jobs with higher prestige generally pay more, usually require more abstract thinking. It's less involved with physical labor and more with mental activity. Generally require more education and generally have greater autonomy. And so again, as far as Weber is concerned, and really in this textbook, I think, and in this course of study, the definition of social class has to do with a combination of one's wealth and property, power, and prestige. Now, if you recall, we looked at the distribution of income in the United States a few weeks ago, and just again a reminder, the top 20% had about 50% of the nation's income, and we also looked at the global distribution of wealth in the last lecture. Here we're looking at the distribution of wealth in the United States, and here you see by this graphic the wealthiest 10% of Americans own about 70% of the nation's wealth. So you can see right there, it's very different from income. You can see the consequences of being among the higher socioeconomic levels here. Actually, I should say the benefits and the perks of being in the upper social classes, because it's a higher percentage of those individuals have a higher percentage of those kinds of things that produce wealth without requiring work and that kind of thing. So the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 70% of the nation's wealth, while indeed the wealthiest 1% owns 33% of the nation's wealth. Again, that 1% that the Occupy movement keeps talking about and is portrayed in some of the films that I had suggested to you last week, in fact. There was an article a couple of years ago in Newsweek magazine that pointed out that the top 400 United States households were raking in more money than the bottom 60% combined. Now, 400 United States households is far less than 1%, far less than 1% of the United States households raking in more money than the bottom 60% of American households combined. And explaining the poor test scores in the United States citizenship test, an NYU sociologist said that unlike in Denmark, we have a lot of very poor people without access to a good education and a huge immigrant population that doesn't even speak English. This is probably a good moment for an aside about Denmark. I had a Danish student some years ago here, and he pointed out to me that not only is there a higher education paid for in Denmark, but it's in fact families are given a stipend to assist them as their student leaves for school. And the entire purpose of this program in Denmark is to be sure that parents don't feel financially responsible for the expenses incurred by the education of its young people. Now, that's very remarkable when you consider the way that higher education is financed in the United States today, and the burden that is placed upon either parents or students who are graduating with large debt. A few things about social status, and one of these is to consider status consistency and inconsistency. When a person has the same levels of wealth, power, and occupational prestige, they're considered status consistent. But if an individual ranks higher in one level of social class and lower at another level, then this is what we refer to as status inconsistency. And the example that I think Henslin uses, and I think to a certain extent it's probably true, is our college professors who have a very high level of occupational prestige. I mean, if an individual knows that one teaches on a university level, it tends to draw respect from the people that are present, and there's quite a bit of prestige associated with being on the faculty of a university. However, college professors don't earn the kind of money you would think, given that prestige, and in fact, sometimes when you see college professors, the old image of college professors walking around in a kind of a ratty, worn out old blazer. That's probably why, because they really don't make a whole lot of money. And so there is some inconsistency there in terms of their level of wealth and their level of prestige, their level of income and their level of prestige. Another example of status inconsistency might be the United States auto worker. Because of strong unions over the years, auto workers have been able to negotiate to a relatively high rate of pay, and yet the prestige that comes from the position itself is not very high. So this is status inconsistency, and Henslin points out that people who are status inconsistent for one reason or another are more likely to be politically active. It's kind of an interesting little feature there, I think, of this discussion. Looking at another model of social class, we look at the Marxist theory, and Karl Marx argued that there were two classes essentially, the capitalists and the workers. Last week I think I referred to these as the bourgeois and the proletariat. You see them here. And really what Marx said was in this theory, your social status, your social class depends upon how close you are to the means of production, whether you're an owner or a worker. And there's actually a third category in Marxist theory that were referred to as inconsequential others, beggars that is, and the homeless and those kinds of things, but they're really not even considered in the discussion about social class with Marx. So he saw basically essentially a two-tiered system of social class, with a third tier of those really too low to consider, basically, in the social ladder. Now, Eric Wright suggested, actually he took Marxist theory and kind of developed that some, and said that he believed that some people were members of more than one class at the same time, and would occupy what he called contradictory class locations, so that somebody perhaps who is a mechanic and would be considered a worker, and yet opens up his own business and becomes a manager of his own work, or becomes petty bourgeois, but he's still a mechanic as well. And so there's some inconsistency and contradictions in their class status with this. But he essentially took Marx's two classes, the worker and the owners, and split it into four classes, the capitalists being the owners, really. The workers you see is in number 4, and in between the petty bourgeois and the managers, the petty bourgeois being small business owners and independent capitalists, let's say, not corporation heads and factory owners and things like this, but smaller owners, and then also managers, who are people that are employed by the capitalists and the petty bourgeois to oversee the workers as they perform their work. Gilbert and Call identified 6 different levels of social class, kind of updating Eric Wright and Max Weber's models, and identified the top class as the capitalist, then dividing the middle class into upper and lower, the working class essentially into an upper and lower, and an underclass. To illustrate this a little more, here is a model from the text actually, talking about climbing the social ladder. Here you see the features that are associated with each of these classes. That, for one thing, the higher you are in the social ladder, the more education you have. And not only do you have more education, but you have received an education at a more prestigious university, at a more prestigious location. Something like Harvard or Oxford or Kenai Peninsula College or Princeton and those kinds of things. Right. Whereas individuals in the lower rungs of this ladder have much less education. Occupationally, you see also that there's quite a difference. And when you look at, while we consider ourselves oftentimes middle class, these are these sort of the lower level managers, craftsmen, and foremen are identified in that class. The working class really involve those individuals who do the sort of this is the worker class in Marxist theory, the ones who are the factory workers, the clerical workers, those involved in retail sales, and I would say the service industry now, craftsmen, those kinds of things. And the working poor are more laborers, and well, actually service workers are listed as in the working poor, low-paid salespeople. And the underclass really almost don't even get a place in the ladder. If you notice, it's sort of a class without a rung on the ladder, and this just kind of reflects the fact that these are individuals who really have almost no standing in the socioeconomic life in this particular model. Now, of interest here, you see where wages fit on this, and you could probably skew this upward a bit, with inflation and things, since this was put out, I believe, in 2008. I believe is what it was. Actually, it says the income estimates were modified in 1995, which is interesting since this was based on a 1998 and 2008 model. But in any event, you can see kind of how the income kind of figures here, and the percentage of the populations you see is sort of a bell curve with very few, that top 1% of the capitalist class, 4% considered in the underclass, and really the class that doesn't even get mentioned here are the homeless. I mean, they're not even mentioned in this, and that's sort of, I think, Marx's inconsequential others. They're not even in this model really when you look at it. It's probably not even a member of the underclass. But the majority of people are in the lower middle or working class in the United States according to this model. Where you exist on this model, where you live on this model, has an impact on your life more than simply how much money you have, because one of the things that we have discovered throughout the semester is a lot of things that are attributable to, say for instance, that are often attributed rather to age or gender or race or ethnicity, really has much more to do with one's social class than anything else. People who occupy a similar social class tend to have similar attitudes, behaviors, and belief systems that more or less kind of determine how they approach the world. And so, for instance, let's take a look at how your social class standing affects your family life. In choices of husband or wife, children in the upper class in particular have a lot more restriction on who they can select as a mate. In marriage and family course that I've taught in the past, the textbook used to say that sometimes women marry up in social class. Men rarely marry up. They may marry down, but generally speaking, it's women marrying up in social class in this patriarchal society. But in any event, there's much more restrictions, so that if you are a child in the upper class, you are really restricted to and expected to marry within your class, whereas in lower classes, lower socioeconomic classes, you can marry up and outside your class. The tensions in life in lower socioeconomic classes tend to lead to higher marital friction and a greater chance of divorce, and so the rates of divorce go up according to this model as your socioeconomic level goes down. Now, of particular interest here too, having read some other books, for instance, I've always kind of been interested in reading about the Kennedy family, and for some reason, and I've had a number of books that I've read about them, and one of the things that was pointed out by more than one of the authors that writes about them is that the lifestyle of the upper class is such that women marrying men in the upper class often understand that this marriage is going to involve a number of mistresses, and that this is one of these things that women in upper social classes know they have to tolerate if they're going to stay married in the upper class, whereas in lower socioeconomic classes that is generally not the case. And so the divorce rate may be lower, or higher rather, in lower socioeconomic classes also, because expectations of spouses are different. And again, this just really reflects the different attitudes about what marriage means and commitment and things like that, based upon your standing in social class. Child rearing is also remarkably different, just looking in between the difference between lower and middle class here, where and some say this is these differences have to do with the kinds of jobs that parents get. In lower socioeconomic classes, we talked about this a few weeks ago, that you tend to get jobs that put you in a position where you more or less take orders. That decisions are made top down. You're told what to do. You do that, and if you do well, you're rewarded. And if you're difficult about it, then you might not get pay raises and things. Okay, and so those individuals go home and basically raise their children in much the same way. Children are raised to be obedient, to follow the rules. Lower socioeconomic group parents are more likely to use physical discipline, but also believe that you don't really have to steer and guide your kids, that if you just kind of raise them to a certain point and let them go, that they'll develop naturally. Whereas people in the middle class really look to have more guidance with their children, use persuasion, discussion. Induction is the term that is used in parenting their kids, where they kind of get them engaged in thinking things through more, and focus more on developing their children's creativity than on the need for them to be obedient. Again, this reflecting more the nature of the types of jobs that those parents probably have as well. It may also reflect the fact that as you move up the social ladder, you're going to have more education as well. And in fact, this is the next consequence of social class that we wanted to talk about, which is that education tends to increase as you go up the social ladder, as you saw in a few slides back, and the type of education one gets changes as well, so that those going into into higher education and upper levels may take more abstract and ethereal kinds of courses of study, whereas individuals coming out of a working class probably are very focused on developing an occupational capacity, and so may be very interested in getting degrees in fields that will give you better jobs. Okay, there's a difference in what one pursues education for, right? To get prepared for work or to have more knowledge. Religion, classes tend to stratify in different religions, as we mentioned during that particular segment some weeks ago. Lower socioeconomic classes tend to be more involved in religions that have much more emotionally expressive worship services. Lower socioeconomic groups thus tend to be more associated with Pentecostal kind of services. Upper socioeconomic groups tend to be more involved in churches that are very controlled and more or less scripted in their services. Politically, you're more likely to be a Democrat all the way up through the working class, and then as you go higher in income, you tend to be more Republican. You are less likely to vote, however, the lower down the ladder you go, and so this would suggest that Democrats or the Republicans have a kind of an edge here, if you look at it from that perspective. Upper classes tend to be engaged in talk therapy a lot more. Lower classes have behavior treatment when they have mental health interventions, and this is there's some truth to this. Having spent a career in and around mental health and social services, I can tell you that I've seen a great deal of difference. In fact, I can just tell you, when I went back for my master's degree, and forgive me if I told you this before, but I worked at a children's home before I left for my master's, and went back to that program after I got my master's degree, and one of the programs we had on that campus was a program for children who were beyond the control of their parents, were misbehaving. They weren't violating the law necessarily, but they may not be going to school. Or they weren't, they were not complying with parental rules and restrictions and such. And so the state of Florida and other states do as well, had a legal provision that allowed parents to take their misbehaving children, before a judge, to basically get the judge to tell them to listen to the parents. It was, I think, considered to be a preventative kind of a thing, but it was called a status offense. And so the status offenders could be, they were offenders because of their status as a minor, essentially, not because they broke a law. They could be brought to court, and in Florida, they were these kids were put in programs that, such as the one where I had worked for a period of time, which was a behavior treatment program, and the idea was to try to help them begin to find other ways of coping with their stresses and strains, and to approach life differently and be more cooperative with their parents. Parents were also put into a parent ed program, but nonetheless, the focus really was on changing behavior. Then I went off to grad school, and in my internship, I work at a psychiatric hospital for schizophrenic adolescents and young adults in the same community. Okay, just up the road, in a upper class section of the community, however. But here we had children coming in, 15, 16, 17 years of age, into their early 20s, who were diagnosed by psychiatrists as schizophrenic. And one child in particular was a 16-year-old boy that I worked with, who had an attorney for a father and had a mother who was a psychiatric nurse. Their family was pretty well to do, and the boy was really uncooperative with his parents, wasn't connecting with his dad. There was concern that he was getting into drugs and alcohol. Some really wasn't attending school correctly and everything. And so what they did was they had him seeing a therapist, and the therapist ultimately had them bring him. Well, he actually was admitted to acute psychiatric hospitalization a few times, but was eventually brought to this program where I was interning, and was placed in this program in residential treatment, where he stayed actually for a few years. Now, what struck me is that this particular boy's behavioral syndrome or whatever was very similar to the behavioral syndrome of the kids that I was working with in the program before I went to grad school. And yet, instead of going to juvenile court, parents were taking their kids to psychiatrists and psychiatric hospitals. So instead of being put in behavior treatment, they were being put in residential psychiatric treatment, and being prescribed medication to control what was determined to be psychiatric symptoms. And so, because this boy in particular, and these kids in general, were raised in families that were probably upper middle class, they were channeled and funneled into the psychiatric system, whereas the kids that I worked with in the other program were working class mostly, and lower middle class, and really were channeled into the legal system. And so here you see the difference in how mental health services are provided depending upon social class. It's really quite it was an interesting thing for me to learn at that stage in my career. Likewise, Henslin tells you that healthcare isn't a right in the United States, it's a commodity for sale. And the lower your social class, the less likely it is that you're going to have the proper kind of health insurance. And so you're going to more likely be sick, and you're more likely going to die before the expected age. You're going to have more days off from work, which of course is going to mean you're not going to get good favor in your job site and those kinds of things, because you're sick more often. And so this is one of the things that the National Healthcare Plan that the President is trying to implement might be able to address. The criminal justice system, will be spending more time talking about this next week, an entire week on this, but one of the things you're going to learn there is the lower your socioeconomic class, the more likely it is that you're going to be dealt with by the police and the courts, and the more likely it is you're going to be put in prison, and in fact, the more likely it is you'll be put to death. So are we mobile? And remember, in a class society, the theory is that you can move up on the social ladder and the social class ladder, and there really is a lot of debate about whether or not social class mobility is what it seems to be in the United States. But In any event, there are different types of social mobility. One is what we call intergenerational mobility, where a change occurs between the generation. The younger generation was afforded better education, say, than the older generation, and so they were able to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps or get pushed up by their parents into a higher socioeconomic standing because of the fact that they could get better jobs. So this kind of mobility is generally caused by individual factors. This is the kind of mobility that we tend to think about when we wonder about poverty. Well, if I could pull myself up, why can't other people? It is possible that if you work harder, that you'll do better. And this is one of the promises of the American dream, is that anyone can advance economically. We're really talking about individual responsibility, individual factors creating mobility. But there are other types of social mobility, structural and exchange mobility, which are really brought about by a change in the social structure that causes a large number of people to move either up or down the social class ladder. This is caused by structural factors in a society. It's not caused by individual effort. And this is the kind of mobility that often holds individuals down in our social economic system, in the capitalist economic system in particular. And this is the kind of thing we're going to be talking about a little bit more in the next segment. Why people are poor, and it's not only about individual mobility and individual fault. It also has to do with structural oppression and discrimination and that kind of thing. And so, with that, I'm going to close off this section of this week's lecture and come on back and listen to the second half once you've taken a break. Thanks.